Thanks very much. Just here in case anybody else comes in. Anyone? There's only 24 registered. I made 30 copies and they're almost all gone, but it's okay. We'll work with it. Unless you're out planning to sell them on the street corners or something. Okay, it's 4:30, and I'd like to start on time. So this course is called officially the Pragmatic Theory, HG 4047. At the graduate level, if any graduate students are sitting in, it's called Meaning in Context. But for me, the name should be The Creation of Meaning. I kind of inherited these other names and was just too lazy to change them. It's a lot of paperwork, so I just said, okay, don't worry about it. Can you hear me okay if I mumble even with my mask on? I want to leave my mask on because I don't like the shield they gave me doesn't fit, first of all. I got a fat head. And the other thing is I need to not get sick. So I'm going to try to stay with a mask. So what we're going to be talking about in this course, the reason why I call it The Creation of Meaning, is we're going to be talking about where meaning comes from. And the idea is that meaning isn't out there in the world. It's created by each of you in your minds, right? So there's nothing, when you see something or hear something or see somebody do something, you create meaning all the time. In natural phenomena, you create meaning also. But it's not, the meaning isn't in the thing itself. The meaning is something that you create to make that thing relevant to you, to make it relevant to your existence, to how you relate to it, all kinds of aspects that adapting to it to a certain extent. And I should turn this on. Right. So we're going to be talking about how meaning is created. And there is a simple way that is done. So basically, we have an instinct to try to create meaning. Like, as I said, in order to survive in the world, we need to make sense of it. We need to be able to understand how is the world going to affect us? How can we better interact with the world? And also, to some extent, what is the world? We're also going to be talking about how relative our understanding of the world is. That it's not objective. What we experience as the world is not really objective. We create the world to some extent in our meaning creation. And this meaning creation is affected by a number of factors, and that's what we're going to be talking about as well. But we have this instinct to try to create meaning, to understand the world through inference, and it helps us survive better in the world, both in the physical world, but also in the world of other people, because we are social primates. We have to live with other people. We can't really survive alone too easily. I mean, some people do, but generally we're in large groups. Our brains have evolved to be able to handle living in groups of at least 75. There is a evolutionary development in terms of the size of the frontal lobe and the size of the social primate group you can live with. So we're able to do that. And the reason why it's important to have this big social lobe is that this is where the meaning creation is going on. And we do this largely through inference, types of inference. We create meaning through inference. Now, there are two main types of inference. One is called demonstrative inference, and the other one is called non-demonstrative inference. Demonstrative inference is a kind of more certain type of inference, but we'll talk about that more in a second. But there is a non-demonstrative. What demonstrative and non-demonstrative really mean is kind of more certain and less certain. So non-demonstrative means you cannot be certain. You cannot demonstrate the truth of it. So that's why it's called non-demonstrative. You cannot demonstrate the truth of it. Whereas with demonstrative inference, which is basically deductive inference, you actually can demonstrate the truth of something. So the induction and abduction are the two types of non-demonstrative or non-certain inference. So let's just go through the three. This is important. I mean, you're probably thinking, why am I in a philosophy class? Well, this is somewhat related to philosophy, but it's also involved in critical thinking and lots of other things. We're also going to be talking a little bit about critical thinking in this class. So in demonstrative, or sometimes called analytic inference, also known as deduction, the truth of the premises guarantees the truth of the conclusion. So it's a tautology. In other words, it's necessarily true. A tautology means you're kind of saying the same thing twice. So if you say all men are mortal and Socrates is a man, then it's necessarily the case that Socrates is mortal. So if the first two, all men are mortal, is true, Socrates, all men are mortal is true, and Socrates is a man is true, then Socrates is mortal is necessarily true. So it's it's just like a mathematical type of equation, which is also a type of tautology. In logic, they also have a more restricted sense of things. So like if you say something like he drank either whiskey or gin, if he didn't drink whiskey, then he must have drank gin, because within logic, either or means definitely one of the two. So it works a little differently from our everyday type of thinking. This is one of the big problems of philosophy, is that natural language philosophy and strict kind of hardcore philosophy, logic philosophy is quite different. Now, what we're going to be talking about mainly is non-demonstrative inference, because this is the main way that we create meaning. Because as we saw, the deduction is actually a tautology. It doesn't tell you anything you didn't know already. It's just kind of reaffirming something that you already knew. And actually the premise, like all men are mortal, comes from an inductive generalization. So actually the premises that are involved in deduction aren't that certain either. So there actually really is no certainty in any of our inferences. But in non-demonstrative inference, the truth of the premises merely makes the truth of the conclusion possible, or probable in many cases. So induction, which you're probably familiar with, is generalization across a set of data. So if every sheep that you see is white, then you're going to think all sheep are white. And some of these inductions hold very well. So if I say the sun comes up every day in the east and goes down in the west, that's also an induction. We have no way to know whether tomorrow it's going to come up in the east and go down in the west. We hope so, because it would kind of mess things up if it didn't. That's still an inductive inference, though. It's still a guess based on our past experience. So we have experience of some phenomenon or something, and so then we assume that it's going to be similar in the future. So if I pick out, say I have a bag of beans, and I pick out 10 beans and they're all white, then I might think, okay, all the beans in this bag are white. But I won't know if that's true unless I take out all of the beans. And in many cases, you can't really do everything. So like say, for example, in England, they used to think all swans were white because every swan they saw was white. But then they went to Australia and they saw black swans. So now there's a phenomenon called the black swan phenomenon, where people are blown away by the fact that they find something that they never expected to find. That's called a black swan phenomenon, because when they went to Australia, they didn't expect to see black swans. They thought all swans had to be white, but all of a sudden there's black ones. It's like, okay, what do we do with that? Now, so that's induction. That's just making a generalization across a set of data. Now, abduction kind of often builds on induction, where you find a reason for it. Okay, why is it that the case? Why is it the sun goes across the sky every day from east to west? And every society will come up with its own idea as to why this is the case, because like I said, we have a natural instinct to try to explain these things. We want to understand them. It will help us in our survival, or at least make us feel better that we think we understand it, regardless of whether we're right or wrong. We want to think we understand it. We really like certainty. And so, like the Greeks, their idea, based on their way of thinking about the natural world and whatever, their idea was that the reason why the sun went across the sky every day was the god Helios driving his chariot of fire across the sky. That made total sense to ancient Greeks, given their belief system. So this is an aspect of this inferences, that we make these inferences based on whatever it is our belief system is. So they will all be very relative and very subjective, the kind of inferences that we make. So nowadays, we have a different kind of explanation about why the sun comes up in the east and goes down in the west. In fact, we don't even talk about it that way. We just say that the earth is spinning instead. A totally different perspective. And so how you look at, the perspective you take in things changes completely the meaning you will make. So it's really, we're going to be talking about that later in a few minutes, about how perspective affects us. So if you take the perspective of the earth not moving and the sun moving, that's one way. And if you take the perspective of the sun kind of hanging, not totally still, but being in one place and the earth kind of spinning around that, then it's a different type of thing. So when we do that, we're trying to explain why things are the way they are. And then this is the main way that we create meaning, this abduction. Charles Peirce was the first one. He's a philosopher from the late 19th century who kind of separated induction and abduction, because in the past, people had seen them all as one kind of inference. But he was the first one to say, no, they're different. He said the essence of an induction is that it infers from one set of facts to another set of facts, whereas hypothesis, what I'm calling now abduction, he sometimes called it hypothesis, he sometimes called it abduction, infers from facts of one kind to facts of another. So the idea here is that you are actually creating meaning by using abductive inference, whereas with the induction, you're not really creating a lot of meaning, you're just generalizing across the things you know already. So induction just infers a rule, a generalization about whatever it is you're looking at, and abduction infers an explanation. So let's give a silly example. An engineer, an experimental physicist, a theoretical physicist, and a philosopher were hiking through the hills of Scotland. Cresting the top of one hill, they see on top of the next hill a black sheep. The engineer says, "What do you know? The sheep in Scotland are black." So on the basis of seeing one sheep, he generalizes to all sheep. That's a very broad generalization, but a lot of people do that kind of generalization. You can do that with, this is one of the things about induction, is how broad do you make your generalization. The experimental physicist is a little bit more conservative, and he says, well, some of the sheep in Scotland are black. And then the theoretical physicist is even more conservative, and he thinks about this and says, well, at least one of the sheep in Scotland is black. And the philosopher, the most careful of them, he says, at least on one side. So because all we've seen is one side, so the only generalization we can really make with any certainty is the side that we have seen. But we don't normally work that way. Philosophers are trained to be really careful in the way they think. But most of us would go with the engineer and just say, oh yeah, all sheep are black, if we've seen them. So this is a common thing in society, that people what we call jumping to conclusions very often, where you're making statements about things that aren't really supported, and that's a kind of inductive inference. But as I mentioned, the main inference involved in meaning creation is abductive inference, and it's finding an explanation. It's basically creating hypotheses. That's why Peirce, when he first talked about it, he talked about it as hypothesis. So you can't be sure that it's right. So when we make up an explanation for something, it really is just a hypothesis. And in many cases, when we hypothesize something, we think we're very smart, so we just assume we're right, because it's the best hypothesis we could come up with, so it must be right. And but the difference between science and all of the other kind of hypothesis creation. So this type of hypothesis creation is what underlies all of religion, all of mythology, all of science, all of basically any kind of system for explaining what's going on. The difference between science and all the rest, and philosophy, of course, as well, the difference between science and philosophy and religion and all the others is that in science you actually try to test your hypothesis. So this is the scientific method. You come up with a hypothesis using abductive inference, But then you try to test the implications of that explanation, your hypothesis. Your hypothesis should have certain implications, and then you test those. Now, the thing is, you can never prove it right. You cannot, science is not about proving anything right. You never prove a theory correct. What you do is you keep testing it to see if you can prove it wrong. And if you can't prove it wrong, then you say, okay, it's working so far. And so you leave it until somebody eventually will come along and prove it wrong. So this is why the universe has changed over time in the history of science, because people will work with a certain understanding for a while because they haven't proven it wrong yet, but then at some point somebody will prove it wrong and come up with a better explanation that explains more things in a better way. And so then the whole concept of the universe may change. So like you had Aristotle's view of the universe, then you had Newton's idea of the universe, then you had Einstein's view of the universe. Now these are completely different ways of understanding how the universe is constructed. And so each one that comes along, but while we are believing those things, we assume that that's the way, because that's the way it is, because we haven't proven it wrong yet. But eventually, like I said, certain factors will come in that will prove it wrong. So for example, to take a minor example, in the history of medicine, in the past, there was an ancient metaphor that they used to understand the circulation system, the heart and the circulation system, which was called the furnace metaphor. They assumed the heart was a furnace, and that's the reason why your blood was red, because it was being cooked in the furnace. Now this goes back to a Greek kind of medical guy named Galen, and that was the standard way of understanding the body until even the 17th and 18th century. But what happened that changed things, even when they first started doing dissection, and they found that what they found in the bodies didn't kind of go along with the metaphor that they were assuming, they thought there must be something wrong with the way they did the dissection. They did not question their metaphor, their framework for understanding how circulation worked. But what happened was somebody invented the mechanical pump, the steam pump. And so once the steam pump was invented, people were like, facepalm. We now have another way to think about things. And so all of a sudden they say, yeah, the heart, yeah, that's working like a pump. All right. So now we have this idea of the heart as a pump. But it took the invention of an external pump to give us the ability to think about it, because this is how subjective our meaning creation is. So, so let's compare the three here. So if you have deduction, for example, you have a rule like all the beans from this bag are white. You have a case, in other words, an individual thing like the beans from this bag. The beans are from this bag. So if I have some beans on the table, and I say all the beans from this bag are white, here are some beans from the bag, so these beans are necessarily white. But if it's induction, I could say all the beans are from this bag, so I have a bunch of beans here, and they're all from this bag, and these beans are all white, so the beans that are in the bag must all be white. Or with abduction, you can say all the beans from this bag are white, and then you have these beans are white, and so these beans must be from that bag. So you're kind of explaining why the beans are white. So actually, there's an interesting way that you can convert each one to the other. But the basic idea is that one just kind of tells you what you already know. The other one kind of just generalizes from the little bit of knowledge that you do have. And the third one actually tries to create an explanation for that. And so Peirce says there are just these three modes of inference, and neither deduction nor induction can furnish me with any new idea. Unless I can get to the bottom of things by hypothesis, I might as well give up trying to comprehend them. Okay, so let's look at what this. So that was a heavy-duty thing, and you can all... We're going to get beyond that. That was just to kind of weed out the weaker ones in the group here. You can all relax now. So now we're going to be talking about real life and real things. Do you see anything in this image? This was a setting that was put in front of me at a cafe in Manila at one point. And when I looked at this, it said, when it was put in front of me, I thought, okay, there's something weird here, and I need to explain it. So this is how our minds work. When we see something that's out of the usual, we take it as a threat. And, I haven't been threatened by too many napkins, but we do take things unusual as generally a threat. And so when I saw this, I said, okay, I need to explain this. I didn't say it out loud. Oh, I need to explain this. Let's call, experts in or something. It's just, I started to think about, okay, why does this look like this? What's the problem here? What stoked my interest? What made me create a hypothesis? What? Huh? Yeah, there's like a circle in there. And normally, napkins don't come with that kind of circle. So what's an explanation? What kind of explanation could I have come up with? What kind of explanation would you come up with? Right. That's the one I came up with too. Now, the interesting thing is the first time this happened, this actually happened more than once to me. Once in Australia, once in Manila. And when I was in the Manila case, the first one, I didn't bother even checking. I just assumed I was right because, like I said, we have this very high opinion of ourselves generally, and we assume that what we figure out must be true. But then later, about 2 years later, I was in a cafe in Australia, and the same thing happened. And there, I actually went to near the kitchen and saw that they had stacked the plates and the napkins together. So that's the science. So then I went to test my hypothesis and did not prove my hypothesis wrong. So the point is that when we see something that's out of the ordinary, we want to try to explain it. Now this again comes from this idea that things that are out of the ordinary may be not only a threat to us, but maybe of some benefit to us. And so then we can take advantage of it. But it's all tied up to our sense of survival. Now, one part of trying to understand the world, because we are trying to understand the world generally, but one part of it is understanding what other humans are doing by inferring their intentions when they do something. And we use the same inferential ability when we infer what other people are doing. And we do this on the basis of our own experiences and motivations. So this is a cartoon of Andy Capp. If you know, Andy Capp is a British cartoon. And this woman here is a neighbor and friend of Andy's wife, sees Andy going into a jeweler and a florist, and she thinks a bit. And she says, I just saw Andy coming out of the jewelers and going into the florist. And Flo, this is Andy's wife in the blue there, she says, oh, it's our anniversary tomorrow. I can't believe he actually remembered. So they interpret his actions in a way that makes sense to them because they know it's the anniversary. They remember it's the anniversary. And they know that on an anniversary, the guy should be buying flowers and possibly jewelry for the wife. And so they put all this information together and they come up with the conclusion that he was going into the stores in order to buy flowers. But then we go back to Andy and he says, do none of these shops have a toilet? So what was his motivation? Was it to buy jewelry? No, it was just to go to the bathroom. And so, you make your meaning based on your own, what you would do in that context. So this is very much an important thing. And that's why they often say, when you talk about other people, you're actually talking a lot about yourself because when you are talking about other people's motivations, you're actually doing it on the basis of what you would do in that situation. Here's another example like that. Normally I use real examples. These are kind of made up jokes and stuff, but they still make the point. So little Johnny and his family lived in the country and as a result seldom had guests. He was eager to help his mother after his father appeared with 2 dinner guests from the office. When the dinner was nearly over, little Johnny went to the kitchen and proudly carried in the first piece of apple pie, giving it to his father, who passed it to a guest. Little Johnny came in with a second piece of pie and gave it to his father, who again gave it to a guest. This was too much for little Johnny, who said, it's no use, Dad, the pieces are the same size. So what meaning was little Johnny making of his father's passing of the pie to the guests? Yeah, so the idea is you say, okay, this slice doesn't look very big. I'll wait for a bigger slice, and then so you're passing it on. So little Johnny doesn't know that, as a what adults know that you, for polite reasons, you always give the first piece to the guest, where little Johnny doesn't have that knowledge. And so he does it just on the basis of what he would do in that situation, which is to wait for the bigger piece of pie. Now, one part of trying to understand what other humans are doing is inferring their intentions when they want you to infer their intentions. So we infer people's intentions all the time, but in most cases, or many cases, oh, that makes it a lot louder. In many cases, they don't want you to guess their intentions. But in many cases, we do want we do want people to infer our intentions. And when we do that, that's really communication. That's what communication is really all about. So in this case, some years ago, I had a woman who would come and cook for me. I was living alone for a while. And so I had a woman, not that I can't cook, but I really can't cook. So I had a woman coming and cooking for me for a while. And she would come in a couple of days a week, and I'd be at work, and I'd come home, and everything would be cleaned up, and there would be food ready to eat. But one day I came home, and there was this thing on the counter. Normally this would be put away inside the counter, but it was on top of the counter when I came home. So that's something unusual. Now again, no attacks from rice containers, but I still thought, okay, I have to think about this a bit. There's two possibilities at least, maybe more, as to why this thing is on the counter. Either A, she just forgot it, or B, she left it there for a reason to communicate something to me. What do you think it was? Yeah, so this is what I inferred, that she left it there for me to notice that there's very little rice left in the container, and so I should go out and buy rice. And so I went out and bought rice. And then the next time I saw her, the first thing she said to me was, "Did you buy rice?" So then I knew that my inference was correct. But this is communication. That's really all communication is. It doesn't matter whether she said something to me or moved her hands and her face in a particular way. All she did was put a container of almost empty rice on the counter, but it still was communication, and that the way that I made the meaning, that I understood her meaning in communicating with me, is exactly the same as if she had said to me, "Go buy rice." So this is the thing, is that linguistics has been very limited in defining itself as the scientific study of language, when it really should be the scientific study of the creation of meaning. In other words, how we communicate and how we create meaning generally. And so for me, linguistics is a much broader field than what most people think of it, particularly due to this, what we call structuralism, which is a lot of the linguistics you've learned so far is what we call structuralism, where you take things out of context and out of the totality of the communicative experience, and you look at, say, a sentence out of context, or even sounds out of context, or words out of context, and that makes no sense at all, because that's not how communication happens. And then, I'm embarrassed to say this, but I also had another woman coming to clean for me. Not that I can't clean, but I can't really clean. She would come in once a week and clean my bathrooms and mop my floors and stuff like that. And then one day I came back and she had put this in my sink. So I had a cup, next to the sink, and she put this cup in there and stuck this little piece of plastic underneath it. And so I looked at this, and then I had to also create some kind of meaning, because this is definitely out of the ordinary. This is not something people do unless they have an intention behind it. So what's the intention you think here? Yeah. Yeah, so I had to notice that the thing was full of water. And so I stood there and waited to see if it would drip. And it did. It was very slow drip, because I hadn't noticed it before. But once I stood there for a while and watched it, it did drip pretty regularly. So I didn't have time to call a plumber. So I took it away. I dumped out the water and moved the cup back to where it normally is. And then the next week she came and did it again. And she was like, "Boy, this guy's stupid. I have to do this twice in a row. My God." So then I texted her. It's like, okay, I'll get it fixed. She even said to me, did you get it fixed yet? And I was like, no, I got to call somebody. Don't worry. So, this is very much communication. Now, this is another time. Now, sometimes we don't know. So even recognizing it as a communicative event or an attempt for communication involves inference. Everything involves inference. Recognizing a communicative, what we call an ostensive act, an act that's showing you want to communicate, even that requires inference. So in this case, this is the same woman. She left this by the door when I walk in the house. This was on a stool next to the door. It's a stool for like putting your shoes on near the door. And since she put this there, and I was like, okay, and it's another message from Lily. And but then I thought about it, and it's like, okay, I can't figure out what the message is, and because this is a piece of my vacuum cleaner. Now, I know again. Our meaning creation depends on the knowledge that we have in our minds, and it's very subjective. So in this case, I happen to know that the vacuum cleaner needs to be washed. I have actually done that before. Wash this, and the filter needs to be washed and dried. So I thought, okay, either she's telling me something about this, or she's just drying the filter. So I texted her and it said, is there something with the vacuum, or are you just drying the filter? And she said, oh, I'm just drying a filter. So in this case, it wasn't a communicative event, right? But this and this, there's really not a whole lot of difference between those two, but I have to infer whether it's communicative or intended to be communicative or not. And this is even true of speech, that when somebody says something, you don't know if they're really trying to communicate something to you or just talking themselves or whatever. Now, again, you see something like this, if any of you walk on the path around campus. When they first did this, I thought it was quite interesting. And I noticed that everybody who walks on there kind of understands what was intended. Now, I don't know what really was intended, but we all kind of assume we know what was intended by them putting this thing we assume they intend this to mean feet, right? That's an inference by itself, to infer that this means feet. And we also have to infer that the direction of the feet is not arbitrary, that we need to infer that putting this on the left side going this way, which is the same as the right side going this way, that has some kind of meaning. So what is the meaning we're supposed to get from that? Does anybody walk these paths? No? What are we supposed to get from that? Huh? I can't hear you. Right? Yeah, keep to the left, yeah. So the idea is, and I've noticed everybody does follow that. When you're walking on there, the people generally will stay to the left. So, without ever really checking on it or anything like that, we can communicate. So communication can take many different forms. So communication is not an exchange of symbolic expressions. It's not a coding and decoding sort of situation. There's a big mistake, especially in particular early computational approaches to language, where they thought that language or communication was all about coding and decoding, and so all we needed to do was put language into computers, and then you could code it and decode it very easily. But it doesn't work, because that's not the way communication is achieved. It's not through coding and decoding. And the kind of artificial intelligence that they developed on that basis, called symbolic AI, based on symbols and the decoding of symbols, that became a joke. And so now AI is focused entirely on more inferential type of learning and meaning creation. It's largely inductive right now, but they're working now on getting machines to be able to do abductive inference, but it's a lot harder. So communication is rather the successful interpretation by an addressee of the speaker's intent in performing a linguistic act. So Green is the author of this book, which I'm going to be asking you to read. I have all the chapters scanned, and they'll be on the Blackboard. So in fact, all the readings that I will give you are going to be on Blackboard. And I will occasionally quote from this, and we can talk about this if you have questions about anything she says. What I'm really going to be doing with this book, though, is to a large extent, I use this book, even though it's kind of an older book. It's one of the more insightful of the pragmatics books. But still, there are going to be things that she says that I will react to. In other words, trying to present a different thing. Because what I'm doing in this course is talking about a way of understanding our meaning creation, which is different from the way it's normally talked about. So she will be talking about kind of the standard ways that people have tried to explain certain pragmatic phenomena, certain types of meaning creation. And I'm going to be arguing against those and presenting a different view. So this is mainly as a foil, you might say, to, but it is good. She has some very good insights in there as well. So here she said, by an addressee by speakers in performing a linguistic act, but like I said, it doesn't have to be a linguistic act. It can be any kind of act. So we often communicate with just moving our hands, moving our faces. This is why emoji are important, because our faces are really crucial to communication. And so that's why we put emoji back in when we write things, because normally you can't see the person's face when you write stuff. Oh, by the way, one thing in my class is please turn off all your electronic devices. I make these handouts and stuff for you so you don't have to access your computers and phones and whatever. And I put on the blackboard, for those of you who haven't seen it yet, I put about 5 or 6 articles about why it's important not to use electronic devices in class or just for learning generally. So I'm not a TEL kind of person. I know the university really likes this stuff just so they can earn their cred as a TEL university, but it's actually not good pedagogically. So we can create meaning using many different methods. For example, there was a scientific article showing how surgeons in the operating theater actually communicate a lot just by moving their bodies in certain ways. Instead of talking when they need a certain, like they need the nurse to hand them a certain tool or something like that, they actually just move in a particular way. So there's lots of ways that we can communicate. Sometimes not doing something. Silence can be very communicative. So not doing something is also communicative. Because part of what the meaning, when we create meaning, part of what is involved there is expectation. So if you expect somebody to say something, they don't say something, that's meaningful then. So there's all kinds of aspects, things that trigger us to create meaning. And Karl Popper, who is the philosopher that is responsible for our understanding of the scientific method, the hypodeductive method it's called, he says, always remember that it's impossible to speak in such a way that you cannot be misunderstood. There will always be some who misunderstand you. Now, I'm not sure he understood why this is the case, but the point is that the reason why it is because our meaning creation is based on this non-demonstrative inference. It's based on this kind of subjective meaning creation, that it's always going to be possible for somebody to create some kind of meaning that you never expected them to make out of what you say. It's always possible for you to be misunderstood. And that's why we have all these lawyers writing laws in very complicated ways, because they're trying to constrain the possible interpretations as much as possible, but they can never constrain the interpretations completely. And that's why we have a Supreme Court. Like in the US, we have a Supreme Court, and the only job of the Supreme Court is to read the laws that were written and try to figure out what they mean. Seriously, that's what the Supreme Court does. It's like they say, okay, and that can change over time. So the Supreme Court can make a judgment on the same law in 2 different periods, like say 50 years apart. They can make a judgment on the same law and say it means something totally different. And this happens because it's all subjective. There's nothing objective about meaning creation. So communication is inherently non-deterministic. In other words, it's not certain, it's subjective. Language simply provides clues for constraining the inference. So when we say things, when we use language, language is a tool. It's not crucial for communication, but we use it as a tool to help constrain the interpretation in ways that are important to us. Now, people don't understand this, so they often get upset when people don't understand what they're saying because they assume language is like this conduit. We use these metaphors like the conduit metaphor, where they think of language, I could put my meaning into words and then send it across to someone else and they can unpack the meaning without any trouble. That doesn't happen. And so the weird thing is that if somebody doesn't understand us, we assume it's their problem rather than our own problem. But it's actually, when you're a speaker, you also have to take into account what the other person might be able to create, what kind of meaning the other person might be able to create. So communication is not something that happens easily. And Green, in her book, says that speaking is an act of faith. And that's very true. So we assume that our communication is going to work out. But if you really pay attention, and I do want you to really pay attention to what's going on around you in your communication every day, that's what the tooth slips we're going to talk about is about. If you really pay attention, you'll find that there are a lot more miscommunications going on than you think. That you assume people are understanding what you're saying, or you assume that you're understanding what other people are saying, but very often, unless the conditions are right, you never find out whether you actually understood or not. And even if you so-called understood, you understood it in your way, which may not be exactly what they wanted. So when a person wants to communicate, they do something which we're going to be calling an ostensive act, which comes from the Latin ostendere, which just means to show. So you're showing the intention to communicate. You make it clear that you want to communicate something. Although it's also an inference in inferring whether the person really intends to communicate or not. So like in Australia, when I lived in Australia, there was something they call the Australian wave. Australia, unlike Singapore, is full of flies, like really aggressive flies. It's really annoying. So if you're walking outside, and we often are out, unlike in Singapore, you walk outside. We're often outside in the bush, and there's just flies everywhere. And so you're constantly doing this. That's why if you ever see the Australian hats with the corks hanging, that's because of the aggressive bugs, to keep the bugs off your face. That's what the corks are for. So people are doing this all the time. So you never know if somebody's waving at you or they're just batting flies from around their head. So it's also an inference to know whether somebody is trying to communicate or not communicate in some cases. And also, of course, even when they say something, you have to infer what it is they said. So it's not necessarily always straightforward that you will understand it. So like I worked in Hong Kong for 8 years, and there everyone spoke 3 languages, English, Cantonese, and Mandarin. And so one day I remember sticking my head out the door and somebody yelled something at me, and I had to think, well, okay, which language was that? And before I could figure out what they meant, I had to figure out, okay, which language was that? Which one made the most sense in this context? And then I could respond to it. So even identifying the ostensive act takes inference. Now the other person has to infer the communicative intention behind the ostensive act. So communication is just these 2 parts, the ostension and inference. And it doesn't matter how the ostension is made, the mental process of the meaning creation is the same. So we make sense. We have this, as I mentioned, this survival technique to expend effort to make sense of things, to find regularities in what we perceive. So we want things to be safe. And so regularity is safe. Regularity is non-stressful. When things are not going smoothly, and then it becomes stressful. And we also, to save energy from an evolutionary point of view, we try to save energy. And so we develop routines, we develop habits. And even we have these, in communication, we have these, what we call adjacency sequences. So like, hello, how are you? I'm fine. These are adjacency sequences. So you have one thing is followed directly by another in a very kind of what we call a conversational routine kind of situation. But you also have genre, you have turn timing. There's all kinds of things that are going on in communication. And so the regularity, though, involved there allows us to conserve energy in terms of knowing what to pay attention to in meaning creation and what not to, but also helps us to be more efficient in our speaking. So you have to learn these conversational routine. So like if you go to a kopitiam here, you have to know how to order your kopi or your daisi or whatever it is you want, daisi gosong, daisi gao gosong, bing, or whatever. You have to know all of the kind of ways to do it. Because if you don't, then people are going to yell at you. The ai will also yell at you. And so these things are really important to our society in terms of kind of just making things a little bit smoother. So we use these types and expectations in interpretation as well. So like when I lived in Hong Kong, I noticed that if you go to a decent restaurant in Hong Kong, the first question they always ask you is, do you smoke, right? Now, when you first walk in the door, they will always ask you that question. And Cantonese restaurants are always very noisy. In Chinese culture, if you're not making noise, you're not having fun. So it's always very noisy. So you often don't hear what the person said. But as long as you know this routine, then you can answer correctly. And then as you're walking to the table, or when you first sit down at the table, they'll say, "Yum mei cha." What do you want to drink? What tea do you want? And this is very regular. So again, even if you don't hear what they say, you can say bole or something, whatever it is you want to drink. And it's the same thing with a lot of these types of interactive routines or conversational routines that we have. Like when you introduce a child in Chinese culture, there's this whole routine where the father of the child or mother of the child will say, "jiao shushu," call uncle or call auntie, and then the child will say, "shushu." Then the other person has to say, "guai," and then the other person has to say, "ni ji nian ji," what year in school are you? And then the child will answer, and then this is a very regular thing. So one time in Hong Kong, I was meeting somebody somebody's kid for the first time. And we were speaking Mandarin, and so the father says that him, "jiao shushu." In those days, I was still shushu. Now I'm yeye. Now I'm an old man, grandfather. But in those days, I was still uncle. So call uncle. And so the kid called uncle. So I said guai, and then I didn't say the following line. I just stopped, and the father just kind of stood there, and he started shaking, and then finally just said, "ta san nian ji." She's third year, because I didn't complete the routine. He felt there was something wrong there. So he had to finish it for me. And I was doing it purposely just to see what would happen if I often create trouble that way. But so we have these very regular types of things, and they help us to create meaning in certain contexts, so you know what's going on. So we are kind of, as I say, essentially this means making sense out of some stimulus by relating it to something in our cognitive and physical environment. So this is the way we understand everything, is by relating it. We can never understand anything totally new. We always understand something, we create new meaning by relating it to something we already know. That's why the more we know, the more we can make sense of things. The more we can make sense of. And this is why, education also has to be gradual. We have this kind of tiered education because you have to build the base to put the next layer on in terms of it. And we have this assumed normality. This is a key feature of our way of thinking, is that there are certain things that we assume are normal. And when we see something that's not normal, then we try to create meaning, just like with the napkin. Or one time I was watching a movie, and at the end of the movie, I don't remember the actual names that were here, but it was done like this, where John Smith and Bill Jones were separated by an ampersand, and Joe Adams, where "and" was written out A and D. And I thought, okay, that's weird. Why would they do that? Any ideas? I mean, I don't know for sure. I came up with my own hypothesis, but I don't know. But does anybody think, why would you do it if you were to write something like this? What possible reason would there be for it?
To indicate that the first two are a kind of collaborative unit who usually work together.
Right. So that's what I came up with too, because there's this sense of what we call iconicity, that the linguistic form somehow represents the reality we have a lot of things in language that are iconic. In the sense that, the tighter the linguistic structure, the tighter the relationship in the real world. So in this case, that was my assumption too. I don't know for sure. This is, again, just a hypothesis. But since I came up with it, it must be true, right? It's just, we can make sense of it in some way. But it is unusual. And my point here is that when we see something unusual, we will create a meaning to try to explain that unusualness. Now, the speaker also has to make inferences. Basically, inferences are just guesses here, this abductive inferences. Hypothesis makes it sound a lot nicer, but it's really just guessing. I think we wouldn't give scientists so much money if they admitted that they were just guessing all the time. So they have to come up with, oh, yes, I came up with a hypothesis. I'm just guessing, actually. Can you give me $1 million to guess about this? No, thank you. So the speaker makes inferences as to what the hearer will be able to understand, and then uses the ostensive act most likely to facilitate the inferential process of the hearer. So we take into account what the other person, we think the other person knows, or how they might react, or what they can make sense of. So if you're talking to a child, for example, you'll speak somewhat differently than if you're talking to an adult. And like, say, for example, you're talking about some specialist thing. If I'm talking about linguistics, I'm talking to you guys, I'm not that careful about what words I use. I will use technical terminology. But if I'm talking to a layperson, someone who's never had linguistics training, then I can't use the same terminology. I can't expect them to be able to understand the terminology or even the concepts. So we have to take into account the other person that we're speaking to, and try to create an ostensive act, whatever the ostensive act is, whether it's physical, whether it's linguistic, that will make it easy for them to understand. And as I mentioned, communication can take place with or without language. There have been functional MRI studies to show that non-linguistic and linguistic communication are processed in the same areas of the brain. So if you've taken Alice's classes, you know that there's processing throughout the whole brain, but we often talk about Broca's area and Wernicke's area as crucial areas for language communication, but non-linguistic communication is also processed there. So those are really areas for communication or inference production, more so than just linguistic communication. Language helps to constrain the inferential process to make it easier for the hearer to infer the speaker's intention, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. So the difference between linguistic and non-linguistic communication isn't a difference in type completely. It's a difference just in mode, like the difference between using a tool and not using a tool. So if I am cutting bread and I want 2 equal pieces of a loaf of bread, then I can use a knife and cut it really carefully, or I can rip it in 2 pieces with my hand. But if I use the knife, I'm more likely to get the outcome that I want. So that's the same thing between linguistic and non-linguistic. Now, maybe in some contexts, ripping it with your hand is all that's needed. And so then you do that. And the same thing with communication. So in many communicative situations, I don't need to say anything, or I need to say something very simple. Whereas in other situations, I need to constrain the interpretation much more. And so then I have to use, these linguistic forms to try to constrain the interpretation much more. So the inferential process can be more or less constrained, but never constrained completely. In other words, it's never 100%. So here's a real example. One time I was having dinner with my wife, and I asked her, do you want something to drink? And all she did was point like this in front of her. And that was her, I assumed, first of all, I have to infer that that was her answer. Then I have to kind of guess what it was she was pointing at. And it seemed like she was pointing at a bowl in front of her. And then I had to notice that the bowl was a soup bowl, and it had soup in it. And I had to notice that the soup was not Western soup, but was Chinese soup. There's a big difference. And so that since she had Chinese soup, and you drink Chinese soup, you don't eat Chinese soup. And so Chinese think of soup as a kind of drink, then she didn't need anything else to drink. And that was her, so her answer was no. Now, I was able to infer all of that because of all the knowledge I have about her and about Chinese culture and about Chinese soup. Because even though we translate tang, Chinese word for soup, and soup as if they're the same, they're totally different. So the prototype concept of what is soup or what is tang and what is soup are totally different. And also the extension, the things that you can apply it to are different. And that's true of every word in every language. So there's no real direct translation. But in this case, so that was the real situation, was this A1. Now she could have said, I have soup. She could have said, no, I have soup. She could have said, no, because I have soup. Or no, since I have soup, I don't need anything to drink. No, I don't want anything to drink. Since I have soup, I don't need anything else to drink right now. All of these could have achieved the same goal, which is for her to tell me that she doesn't need any drink. But she chose the simplest one. And normally with people we know well, you will do that. But if she was in a restaurant, and a waiter asked her, do you want anything to drink? I don't think she would just do that. She would use one of the more explicit ones. Now you'll notice that they all constrain the interpretation to a greater or lesser extent. And they do the same with both lexical items and with grammatical marking. And so one of the things is some theories, they will say that grammatical marking and lexical items are very different in the kinds of meaning they convey. But I don't think that's necessarily the case. From the point of view of this inference, they're both constraining the interpretation. It's just one is more general than the other. The grammatical words are more general than the lexical items. But they're both constraining the interpretation. Now, we often will, like I mentioned, have these conversations with people, and this is what I want you to pay attention to in your daily life. In a minute, I'll talk about the tooth slips. I want you to go home and write, pay attention to your experiences around you and your meaning creation and other people's meaning creation and interacting with you, and write it up. And you will notice things like this. One time I was at a dinner party, and somebody sitting at the table, we were at this person's house for the first time, and the one person looked at the hostess and just went like that, kind of looked, and put the eyes up and the fingers up and pointed up and back. And the hostess said, it's the first door on the right. So the person got up, went to the first door on the right, and then came back and was very happy. What do you think that was all about? Yeah, went to the toilet. So nobody mentioned toilet, but everybody understood it was about toilet. The first person didn't say a single word. But the hostess could understand that, okay, it's the first time somebody came to the house, they just had dinner, they've been eating, drinking, probably needs to go to the toilet. And so just said it's the first door on the right. She also didn't mention toilet. She just assumed everybody was talking about the same thing. And this kind of conversation we have all the time. We don't even notice it as something strange, but we have this kind of thing all the time. Like a lot of times when people say something, what they really intend you to get isn't what they say. So like just last night, when we were eating dinner, my wife said to me, we had sat down, we started eating the Thai, but we were waiting for the rice to finish cooking, eating the food when we were waiting for the rice. And then all of a sudden she heard the ding of the rice cooker, and then she looked at me and she said, seems the rice is done. So what did you think what meaning do you think I created there? You have to get up and get your butt up there and get the rice and bring it back here. And so I understood that completely. She didn't have to mention, go get the rice. All she had to do is kind of bring to my attention that the rice was done, and I could figure out everything else. So this kind of stuff goes on every day, all the time. And even if you have something that seems very explicit, like, and this is also a real situation, I've had lunch versus I've been to China, you have to infer, like, okay, when did this happen? Like in English, we have tense, which constrains the interpretation of both of these to something in the past. But English doesn't constrain how far in the past this would have been. So you have to guess that when I say I had lunch, it wasn't 2 years ago, it was probably within the last 2 hours. Whereas I've been to China, it's probably not in the last 2 hours. That would be a really quick trip. So you would take into account a lot of real-world knowledge to try to figure out exactly what the person's intention was in using the same forms. And one of my favorite examples is one time when I was in Hong Kong, we used to call roll, see who was in the class. And so, I get to the list and I said, Alan, and then a student in the back of the classroom pointed to an empty chair and said, toilet, right? That's all the person said. Now, if we think of communication as being based on interpreting the words themselves, coding and decoding kind of thing, we could look up the word toilet. This is from the dictionary, the Merriam-Webster dictionary. And we can find all kinds of meanings for a toilet. It's an archaic word for dressing table. It's actually the doily that goes on top of the dressing table. The act or process of grooming oneself. It can be a bathroom, lavatory, or privy. And a few other things, and even gives you the origin. Is any of this really relevant to understanding why the student said toilet? No, not at all. What is important about using the word toilet here? Because of what? Say louder. Yeah. So, but why? How is toilet different from, say, library or canteen? What do you know about? Oh, yeah. Yeah, he'll come back, right? So the meaning that I created from him, his use of the word, just pointing at the empty chair and that one word was, Alan was here, he was sitting in his chair, but he went to the toilet, he'll be back in a minute, so don't mark him as absent. I created all that meaning just from that simple ostensive act. And the reason why is because the word toilet, because of what we know about how people use toilets. Of course, if you want to go hang out in the toilet for an hour or two, you can do that. I don't know if anybody does, but that's what makes it different from, say, library. If he had said library or canteen, then I wouldn't expect Alan to come back right away. But normally, most people, this is again this assumed normality. Or normally, people will go to the toilet and actually even come back to the place where they came from before they went to the toilet. So of course, we can go to the toilet on the way to somewhere else. But very often, we leave someplace, go to the toilet, and come back within a few minutes. And so that's why I created the meaning that I did. And we do, like I said, this is so usual. It seems like a crazy thing when we talk about it, and I say, oh yeah, the word toilet got me to create all that meaning. But this is how we make meaning all the time. And I want you to be able to pay attention to it and be able to talk about these things. So here's another example of almost like with my wife's example, where Calvin is making a water balloon and he's about to throw it on Hobbes. And all Hobbes says is, as if life isn't short enough. And so then Calvin decides not to throw the water balloon and just sits down, right? So Hobbes doesn't have to say to him, okay, if you throw that water balloon at me, I'm going to rip your head off. All he has to say is, if life is, and then Calvin can infer what the actual intention is behind there. So what's important is not what people say or the actual ostensive act itself, but what meaning you create on that basis. And that's going to be different depending on who you're talking to or the situation you're talking to, and all kinds of other factors. So the degree to which the hearer is forced to deduce a particular interpretation depends on the degree to which the form of the utterance constrains the hearer in choosing particular contextual assumptions necessary to achieve the interpretation. So what I mean by contextual assumptions is all of this kind of knowledge that you bring to bear in understanding the other person's intention. And so what you put these things together, and then you can achieve an interpretation that makes sense in that particular context. The form doesn't have to be familiar to the addressee. So as I mentioned, we often just have to infer what the ostensive act is. That the form doesn't have to be familiar to us for us to make sense of it, as long as we can infer the speaker's or person's intention. So like when I went to Australia, I was really amazed at how different Australian English was from American English, because I grew up in America and I thought, well, we speak English. And then I went to Australia and found that they supposedly speak English, but it's like so different. And for weeks, I had no idea what I was doing because they use the language so differently. Even grammatically, grammatical patterns are different. Their use of tense is different. It really drove me nuts for a while. But then I learned to talk like them, and that was really scary when I started talking like them. It's like, oh my God, I've lost my ability to speak English well. But they would say things like feedbacks here or diarize in these are actual notices from the university. And I'd never seen those words before, but I can figure it out, what the intention of these people in using these expressions like that. Or in this case, you can probably figure out the intention of these people putting these images. These images are not letters. These images are Irish icons, religious icons. They have nothing to do with the letters that you might be putting together in your mind to create a particular meaning. But anybody create a meaning here? Google, yeah. So Google now does this regularly, and because people expect it on their home page, they're getting more and more wild. So this is also Google, and this is also Google. Now, again, this is why I said our expectations often influence the inferences that we make. So if you did not have the expectation of this being Google, you would never create the meaning Google by looking at this. Now, of course, one of the things about the inference of how you create meaning is your perspective in it, as I mentioned a little bit earlier. So the same image, just to show you that the meaning is not in the image, the same image looked at from different perspectives can make you create different meanings. So like, what does this say? Come in, right? What does this say? It's the same sign. This is one of my colleagues here. When she's not in, she puts it this way, and when she's in, puts it the other way. So that's a brilliant example that it's just a matter of how you look at it. So look at my t-shirt, right? What does it say? Does it say don't quit, or does it say do it? You can make two different meanings depending on how you look at it, your perspective. So it shows you the meaning is not there. The meaning is here when you create it. Or like this one, we don't, I'm not going to read this and say, caution, wote floor. What is that? I don't know. I get really scared or something. I can figure out that even though the spelling is wrong, I can figure out what that's supposed to mean. Or this one where it says wet paint, but I know there's no wet paint there. It's just he didn't have a wet floor one, so he used a wet paint one to mark wet floor. Or this one, if you can read Chinese, this was in the parking lot of Peking University where they used one of the words here is the wrong word, but it sounds the same as the right word. So you can, even without that, you can probably figure out what's going on here, but it just says no parking, but it's using the wrong, instead of the jin here should be a different character, much more complex character, so they just replaced a simpler character in there. Or this one, if you look at this, what meaning do you create? Do you see 525? What if I turn it upside down? 252. It's actually not either one. It's just a geometric shape. It's not a number at all. But we will try to make sense of anything we can make sense of. So it's all relative to our own perspective as well. So when we try to understand something, as I mentioned, we try to relate it to what we know or our own experiences. We can't really understand things that are outside of our experience. So like if you know Bob Dylan, when he was very famous, he won the Nobel Prize for literature and everything. And his grandson, though, has no experience of how famous his father was back in the 60s. Those of us who lived in the 60s, we know how big he was. But for Pablo, Dylan's grandson, he said, I mean, really, my grandfather, I consider him the Jay-Z of his time. So for him, he can only understand popularity in terms of what he has experienced. And he experienced Jay-Z being very popular. So he can, that's how he makes sense of his grandfather's popularity, by relating it to Jay-Z's popularity. And this is how we create meaning a lot of the time. Or like this one, when this was first built, it didn't have a name. Now it has a name, right? And they did this with the Hive as well. Before they gave it the name the Hive, we all called it the dim sum building because it looked like dim sum boxes piled up. But this one, what did you think? What would were you here when this was first built? Did you guys have your own way of calling this building? Or you didn't care about it enough to come up with a name? So, one time, you know Scott Moisick, our phoneticist, right? One time we were standing there, near there, and he said, oh yeah, the pallet building. I was like, the pallet building? And I said, yeah, it looks like a pallet. You know the pallet, the roof of the mouth, and then the alveolar ridge. And I was like, whoa, so this is a perfect example of how we relate to what is most salient to us, right? Because he's a phoneticist, and he's actually wrote a paper on how the shape of the palate influences the sounds we make. So for him, the palate is a very salient kind of image. So when he saw this, it's like, boom, yeah, this is a palate building. And of course, once he mentioned it, I could understand it, but it's not something that would appear, even though I studied phonetics also and taught phonetics here, it's not the first thing that would come to my mind. Whereas for him, that was the most natural thing to think, yeah, this is the palate building. And of course, we have to have certain types of knowledge to be able to appreciate or understand what's going on in some ostensive acts. So in this one, for example, you see 3 letters, and if you're an English speaker, you will just see this as the normal Lay's potato chip image, possibly. But it's actually not. This is actually the Thai letters for E, L, and Y. So it says Lay, but it's written in Thai letters rather than English letters. A little bit exaggerated to make it look a little bit like the Lay thing. But you can understand that if you know Thai. So again, what knowledge we have will help us to understand things. The same with this one. If you look at this package, if you only speak English, you might only create one meaning, which is USA. But if you speak Thai, you will know that this is the brand Brill, B-R-I-L. It's written there. I forgot my pointer today, sorry. But so these are actually Thai letters. So the U-looking one is a B, the S-looking one is an R, the little thing on top is an I, and then the thing that looks like an A is actually L, the Thai alphabet. So if you have that knowledge, you can appreciate both. And then like this one, this is just this morning. I was in the Chinese traditional medicine thing, because I go there. And I saw this magazine title. And so what's going on with this? The word alumnus means somebody who's an alumni of some university. So why did they write it like this? It's a magazine cover. Who is this for? Huh? Somebody said something. So, I mean, the way I understand it is this is for alumni or an alumnus of NUS. But you have to know what NUS is in order to understand that. And so being in Singapore, of course, we know NUS means someplace in Clementi. I don't know much about it. Just kidding. On a scale, but again, it's you're related to what you know. On a scale of 1 to 10, how likely is it this question is binary? And the other person says 4, and she says, what's a 4, right? So what does that mean? What's the answer to her question? Well, binary means there's only 2. So there's no 4 in binary. There's only 1 and 0 so on a scale of 1 to 10, it has to be 1 or 10. It can't be anything in between, because that's all there is in binary is 1 and 10. Now, if you have two languages, again, you can make more sense out of this than if you only have one language. So any of you who can read Chinese, look at that image from two different perspectives. It's just like my shirt. You can make two different meanings out of it, either 中国 or China. Can you see that? Everybody see that? So I thought that was pretty cool. This is a real sign. So I think that's all we're going to cover for today. And next time I'll go into the nature of language itself, language as culture. So we'll continue with this first introductory thing. But I first just went out a little bit longer than I wanted to. But I want to go back. First of all, any questions about all of that so far? Yeah.
Would you distinguish between communication and the creation of meaning, or are they the same?
So creation of meaning we do all the time. We're always creating meaning. And the difference between communication and just every other meaning creation is just somebody intends for us to create a particular meaning. And if we do that, then it's communication. If we don't make the meaning that they intended us to make, then it's not communication. There's a breakdown. But yeah, so the only difference is whether or not someone intended for us to make that meaning. Okay, so last time a lot of you weren't here, so I'll just very quickly go through the course outline and what about the course here generally. So we're going to be talking twice a week. We're going to be meeting twice a week instead of one long 3-hour thing, which is horrible for everybody. So we'll be doing like an hour, generally an hour and a half each time. And sometimes less, depending on what we're doing. And so on Tuesdays, I'll generally be doing something like a tutorial. And part of the tutorial will be doing some exercises to practicing stuff. Possibly this time tomorrow, we'll probably see watch some short videos and discuss them. But also, I'm going to have you write these things, kind of observations, which I call tutorial slips. So I want you to pay attention to what's going on around you and kind of describe your meaning creation. Don't just tell me what meaning you created, but how you created it, because that's the important thing is understanding how and why you created the meaning you did. And I put an example of a good toot slip on the blackboard. So this, what we're trying to look at in this course is meaning creation is very generally. And so we have the lectures on Monday, the tutorials on Tuesday. Hope you do the readings. We'll be looking at some data analysis and discussion of the issues related to the creation of meaning. So the rules of the course is no electronic devices, no phones, tablets, or computers are to be used during the class. And I'll be giving you handouts at the beginning of each lecture that you can write on instead of looking at a computer or something. The course outline I've given, those of you who came last week, I've revised the course outline and given you a new version because last week we weren't able to do anything. So so today starts week 2. And I've got the readings there. Hopefully you'll do the readings. They can all be downloaded from the website. We'll have 2 quizzes during the course. They're only 10 questions, short answer or multiple choice. So no big deal, no stress. And I do a review before them anyway, and I give you all the answers. Seriously, I found it makes no difference at all to the marks. If I give you this is a weird thing. I've been doing this for many years, that I spend an hour reviewing everything and make sure that I say the answer to all the questions at least 3 times in my summary, and still people get them wrong. So it's just an interesting phenomenon about communication, that it's what the teacher says is not necessarily what the students get. I actually had a PhD student in Australia who did a study on this, where she studied history classes, and she recorded the classes and then interviewed the students and the professor. The professor, okay, what meaning did you intend for the students to get? Then she interviewed the students, okay, what meaning did you get? And she found that they were quite different. So it just shows you that, communication is not a certainty at all. So this is the first, this assignment 1 is the tutorial thing. So we call it tutorial slip or toot slip. And so starting next week, at the end of the tutorial session, you bring it with you to tutorial session, typed nicely. I don't want you writing it out in class. So you type it nicely, double-spaced times, because also I comment on them. Put your name, the current week, and an example of the interesting phenomenon. Now, it doesn't have to be particularly what we're talking about that week. Anything that you find interesting. It's just I want you to discover. There's 2 motivations for this. One is to develop your awareness of what's going on. The other one is to kind of test what I'm saying to see how useful it is. Because in linguistics, there's no right and wrong, but there's useful and not useful. So like, I don't think Chomsky stuff is useful. And you may hear that once in a while from me, like every other day. But what I want you to do is to see if what I'm telling you about language fits your experience and whether it's useful to you in understanding your own behavior, because it's really about behavior and other people's behavior. Because part of what I'm hoping you will get from this is because the language, we don't treat language as a thing, but as a behavior, and the principles and cognitive abilities that underlie that linguistic behavior are the same that underlie our other behavior. So once you start to understand that behavior, and it's a very common behavior we do, it gives you a way into understanding human behavior more generally. So, and a lot of my students do find it very useful. So I want you to try to test it, to see if it's, and if you find problems with it, then come back and we can discuss it. And as I mentioned, a couple of short quizzes and then class participation. And there's some readings, and they'll all be on Blackboard. So that's basically it. Pretty simple. Any questions about that? Yeah. Yeah, if you can get that in a half a page. But yeah, that's exactly the kind of thing. It's like when you think, you were trying to express one meaning and they created some different meaning, or vice versa, or just some kind of interesting interaction between people, and then not only what happened, but why you think it went the way it went, right? So it's something unusual that you think the communication didn't go the way people wanted it to go. So then what factors were involved? Because we're going to be talking about lots of factors that come into our understanding of what people are doing. So you'll find that it's so subjective down to the second, like what is happening around you will influence, or what just happened before will influence the meaning that you created. And so all of these things are what I want you to talk about. It can be 1 page or even a little bit more than a page, but it doesn't have to be long. Just mainly getting you to understand why was the meaning that you created, why did you create that meaning? That's the key thing. Yeah. Oh, this one we'll talk about on Tuesday. So those are not questions. Those are just examples of things that people say where you're expected to create some kind of meaning that actually isn't there. So that's just the point of how we often say things to get somebody to create a meaning that actually isn't in what we're saying, kind of like the examples I gave just now. So we can talk about those in the tutorial tomorrow.
For the examples for the tutorial slips, should they be from spoken language only, or can we
Anything. But I don't want you to just go to SGGag and just download a bunch of stuff and then comment on what it means. That's pretty uninteresting. So really try to pay attention to like natural communication in your life. Although I will be using lots of memes and gags and stuff in my examples, but hopefully you will go a little bit farther and pay attention to what's really going on, unless you get really desperate and need something There are a few favorites. The Big Bang for a while was really, because there's a lot of crazy pragmatic stuff going on in the Big Bang theory, so sometimes people would use those. But really, I prefer if you can really pay attention to your own life and see what's going on in your interactions with other people. Any other questions? Some other questions? Okay, that's all for today then. Good. Yeah, just about right. Yeah, if you didn't get a handout, there's still a couple here. Yeah. Well, one left.